Okay. So, what's your name?
My name is Lee.
Carol. Hey.
Who's that?
Hey, Buddha.
Hello, Patricia.
Oh,
Hi.
Who are you talking to?
I'm talking to
Video.
myself.
He's trying to figure out how to do that.
She's doing.
FaceTime.
She's got
No.
128 questions.
200 some.
200, excuse me.
Okay.
Ah,
So, your full name.
Lee Clement Lanois.
Oh,
Were
what
you
would
named after
like?
anyone?
No,
Would you like something over here?
Your mother must have liked the name, huh?
someday you can ask her.
What was your date and day of birth? So, we don't know the day, but we know the date, right?
June 15th, 1931.
Okay.
Okay,
So, you were
So
born.
we're going to stop this right now. Are we going to continue?
Yeah, we're going to continue for a few more minutes.
Okay.
I want to get it. We can always edit. That's the thing.
Fine. We lost our balance.
Okay. Hey, buddy.
Okay, I'm on. I'm
Okay.
on.
So, you were born in what city?
Providence, Rhode Island. Line-In Hospital.
Do you know the circumstances of who was present?
Well, who was present was nobody that I know of, except that there was one lady in the room with my mother, Bailey,
And then your
and she had the birth of her child the next day, and I call her my pseudo sister, Claire Bailey.
Claire Bailey.
And we never left each other's communication. We buried her one day, and I was there.
So your brother, his name was,
Gerald Douglas Lanois.
and his birth date was,
April 15th, 1934,
and your mother's full name.
was christened Annie Evelyn Lanois, Dwyer.
Dwyer.
Dwyer, correct.
And she was, and your father's full name was,
Cleophas Jeremiah Lanois.
and your mother's date and place of birth,
Was Medford,
Mass.
Massachusetts on January 6th, I think 1892.
Okay. And your father's date and birth?
December 19th, 1889.
And that was in St. Gabriel's,
In St. Gabriel de Brandon, Canada.
north of Montreal, Canada.
Yes.
What was the family nickname
For
for you?
there was none. Because when I'm 40 years old, I asked my mother, how come she named me Lee? And she said, because nobody could nickname it. And it was right. I never had a nickname except a couple of guys I worked with called me Leland.
And,
But I really was only with them for a few years.
and so what were your parents' nicknames?
Leo was my father, and there were some people that would call my mother Evie.
What does your dad do?
He was a carpenter by trade. He was a carpenter in the Navy in World War I. And he became a machine operator for his brother in the late 20s and right through 1956. He operated machines for his brother in the pencil making business.
And it was Lou.
Louis was my father's brother. He nicknamed Lou, L-O-U.
And that was the manufacturing name?
And that was, the manufacturing name was L-E-W. We never got a name explanation, but that's okay.
So later on they sold the business.
Well, the business was bought out by a guy from Florida in,
But it had a different name because the,
Well,
the
oh.
brothers had split. So we can talk about that later.
moment, in, let's see, 2010 or 11, I visited and I found out that the great-granddaughter had sold the business to a guy in Florida, and they were making pencils and pens under the name of Garland, Garland.
And their last name was, the granddaughter was Lanoie.
Yes, she was, maybe she was the daughter of Raymond. I think she was the daughter of Raymond Lanois, Lanoie, yes.
So tell me about your mom. She worked outside of the home, correct?
Well, she started out as a jewelry worker after they moved from Medford down to Providence, which is where her two uncles were living, Uncle Mike and Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom was not around when I was a child. He had passed in the early 1930s.
So her and her sisters were left alone because...
Oh, my grandfather, in 1904, there was no work in the Boston area, and he was a construction company. So he left to go to Colorado, and out in the hills, the name will come to me eventually, and he built a house out there for himself, and he built one for the mayor, and they put running water in those houses. This was a big thing.
And what was your grandfather's full name?
Daniel, and I don't know the initial, but he was Daniel Dwyer.
Okay.
And they had 3 boys and 4 girls. He never came back to Providence, only in the casket, and he's buried at St. Mary's out in Cranston.
So you visited there? You have visited his site?
Whenever I go to Rhode Island, I go see my mother and father's site, and my grandparents and grand aunts and uncles. Big site.
What'd your dad do for a living?
He was a carpenter.
Oh, we already went over that.
Yeah.
Sorry. And your mom, we went over
She
that.
went through the jewelry, she went to the telephone operators, and then she ended up in the bank, which is where she stopped working when I was born. And the funny story that we live with even today is Aunt Wynn showed up, and my mother and father had a little Boston Terrier they called Niggy. And Aunt Wynn conned my mother out of the dog called Niggy, and they named it a word with the same phonetics as Niggy, but I can't think of the name right now. But at any rate, they took the dog away. That dog showed up through the years from the 1930s to the early 40s at our house because my uncle would go off on business trips. They'd leave the dog in the car at our house. And so we got to play with that dog. When that dog died, my aunt went to the Haggerty strain of that dog of Boston, and they had 4 or 5 of them. They came in the room and just sat there and she didn't move. And they were all running around and everything. One of them sat at her feet. And when they said to all the other dogs, come on, let's go, this one stayed right there. So that's the one she took. And that dog continued on into the 50s, early 60s.
And that was Aunt Wynn's dog?
That was Aunt Wynn's dog by her rights, or whatever.
Sounds like she liked Boston Terriers.
Oh, that was the only reason she liked one was my mother had it.
So it's sort of like a sibling rivalry.
Yeah, you can call it that.
So, did anyone else help with the child rearing around the house?
There was nobody that helped specifically at the house. There was one lady who turns out to be a juried artist, as Pat was, and she lived over on Tennyson Road. Her name was Elizabeth Pinkham, and she's the one that painted the painting of all the modes of transportation that I used to have at the house, which I no longer have. I have pictures, but I brought that painting back to Charleston and gave it to the museum. Yeah, Charleston, Rhode Island. Gave it to the museum down there. I said, this belongs down here. And at any rate, she had a son, Pinkham, a Philip Pinkham, and we played as kids. He was about 4 or 5 years older than I was, but
So, longtime friends with your mom.
well, it was a time friend when we lived in Lakewood. I lost track of him. I didn't see him until he was aged and decrepit when your mother and I visited him, looked him up.
Did anyone else live in the building where you were?
No, the kids across the street were the Myers, Eddie and Bobby,
I meant
adults.
adults.
No, it was a house my mother and father built.
But as you moved later,
Oh,
you mentioned there were
okay.
aunts that lived in the house. And
So,
there were some people upstairs.
my father, one story about my father was it was a Dutch colonial. And one day, this is a story from one of the neighbors. One day she looked up and there's a hole in the roof. And they looked up at the end of the day and there was a dormer in its place. Bang. She couldn't figure out how it occurred. My father had cut the hole in the roof early in the morning and he had the dormer already built. And so all he did was take it up the stairs in 2 pieces and put them in the hole that he created. He had assembled the whole thing, prefabbed it, and put it in, because he was a carpenter. He could measure and cut so that it fit perfectly.
Wow.
He did that in Providence. When we moved to Providence, there was a big kitchen sink, and there was nothing underneath it. So my mother says, I need a place for pots and pans. And he said, okay. He took his 2-foot ruler out, and he made some measurements, and went downstairs, and a day or so later, he came back with a completely prefabbed unit that slid exactly under the sink with a door with a latch on it. And so we had a cabinet under the sink and a shelf in there so you put stuff. That took care of the garbage can, trash can, call it what you want, and another place for some odds and ends. Yeah.
So the folks, when you moved to this
Okay.
place in Providence.
Okay. My mother's aunts and uncles gravitated from Connecticut to Providence with their siblings, Tom and Mike. The thing that I got to tell you about my grandfather, he built a house in Medford, and the horse carriage and all the whole business, the buildings, and of course they lost the whole thing when they ran out of money and came to Providence. But the funny part of the story is that he was ready to marry a lady in Medford. And for some unknown reason, she died within 6 months of the wedding.
Oh.
So they sent Daniel, because these guys are all Irish and they're all connected, they sent him down to Saybrook, Connecticut, because they knew there was a family that had 4 or 5 gals in that family. And they sent him down there. This is my narration, okay, but I'm sure it happened. They sent him down there to make the pick of the litter.
What?
And he picked out Catherine, because there was Annie, there was Mary, there was
Catherine?
well, there was Catherine, Mary, and Annie, and another one whose name escapes me right now, gals in this family, and Mike and Tom were there as youngsters. And so he picked out Catherine, and they got married.
Sort of an arranged marriage?
Well, if you call picking the one you like that smiles the nicest, you know, what would you think a guy would do who's ready to get married and his girlfriend dies?
So
He now is confronted with 4 women that are ready for marriage.
So how old would you say he was? Was he older than her?
Oh yeah, a couple of years older, the normal kind of thing. Yeah.
Just remember when you're telling this story that this is going to go in history, Dad.
Hey, it's the truth.
That is not
Hey,
the
he
truth
went to
of that
he
story
went to
at
Connecticut.
all.
He went to
Dad,
Connecticut.
it was a big Irish family, and he didn't have anywhere to go. So that relative said he could go. He happened to fall in love with one of those sisters, and he asked her, after almost a year of begging her, not any of the other sisters, but her, to
You
marry
know this?
him. And she refused to marry him.
You know?
And she said, if you don't change your ways with your drinking, nobody's going to marry you. And he had to promise that he would never drink another drop in his life. And then they got married.
Who told you this one?
Nobody told him to
Who
go
told
and
you
pick
this
the
one?
litter. Go and pick the litter of that
Well,
bride
this is
young
my
man.
word.
Just remember when
Hey.
you're telling the
Hey.
story that women are not dogs, Dad.
No.
And this is a new age, and I'm offended by that.
Okay.
So be very careful when
Hey.
telling this story.
Did you get this story from my mother?
Dad, we are not a litter of dogs to be picked from.
Okay.
So make sure
Edit,
when you're telling the story, you're
We
telling
might
it
edit a
respectfully.
little bit,
But
but
he had to change his whole life to marry her. He could not find anybody else, and he really loved her, and he had to change his whole entire
You
life.
did.
And
So-
he did.
so they moved from Medford.
Okay. He went from 1904, he went to Colorado. And he became a construction company in Colorado.
So he left the love of his life to go.
He left the 3 boys and the 4 girls.
Wow, what a guy.
And the youngest one, Maisie, was married. And he left a whole bunch of them there. Hardly never sent, he may have sent money back, who knows.
He never sent any money back.
Well, then he probably didn't.
I heard from your mother. He did in the beginning.
Well, maybe he
Then-
did.
Then he got married, and that was it. He married outside of his own marriage. He married again in Colorado.
He did?
Yeah, that woman died, and then he married another woman.
This is history I don't know.
Yeah, so
Never heard it.
that's what I heard.
Well, if you heard it from
And
my...
then your mom went out to visit him when she was 18.
Yeah, she went to another time, 2 times.
Yeah, without
She took her mother with her one of the times.
Yeah.
So, at any rate...
So the question was,
Yeah. Oh.
did any relatives live with you? And you mentioned there was the.
Okay, after we moved to Providence, my father bought, when we moved to Providence, he bought a three-family house. And the top floor was sleeping rooms. So anyway, Aunt Mary and Aunt Annie, which were the siblings of Tom and Mike, and the siblings of Catherine, and I can't think of the 4th child's name down there, but at any rate, so they were set up in the 2nd floor, and my father said, Lee, we're going to put heat up there. And he got this, he measured out all the piping he needed and the radiators, and we lugged the radiators upstairs, and we set up a workshop down in the basement, and he would give me the measurements of each piece of pipe to cut and thread when I came home from grammar school.
So what was it, 12?
Yeah, I'm 12, 13, something like that.
And so.
He showed me how to do it, and then I had a job when I came home from school.
So it sounds like your dad and mom worked pretty hard and through the Depression too.
Well, my mother stayed home with me and my brother.
But she also worked.
No,
No.
she did
worked.
not work until around 1952, and then she went to work in an office of a jewelry factory, and she was 58 years old then, and she told him she was 48. And she looked it. She pulled it off.
So we'll get to
Yeah.
some of that later.
Are you kidding me?
Yes, she did. She lied.
She pulled it off?
Yep.
Well,
Because
she
didn't look like she didn't pull anything off. She tried.
well, she did.
She did.
didn't pull it off.
That is a story that's true. So what's your favorite memory of your dad? We talked about this earlier about he had a good eye. He was a natural athlete.
Yes.
He was also part of an industrial baseball league.
Somehow I never got a story out of it. The story I got was when we were burying him, one of the shirt-tail cousins came over and told me my father was a hell of a baseball player. And he had an eye, and I do have from my mother's notes that she wrote, and said when they walked into a baseball park a number of times that the men of that time in 1928, like that, they would stand up and say, "Hi, Leo, you're doing good."
So he always went by Leo.
Yeah. He was well celebrated by the guys that knew him from the baseball era.
So what's the story about Johnson's Pond and him throwing horseshoes and pretty much like the king of horseshoes?
He was. Okay. In 1932-ish, we had a camp on Johnson's Pond, which was nearby the camp buildings that my father built for his sister and his brother. And that camp was made out of doors.
Oh.
We were the not so rich relatives. They paid my father $25 a week forever until after World War II. But at any rate, he figured out he could put a camp together very economically by building it out of doors. And we were down there, Joan and I were down there one day years ago, and we were talking to a bunch of kids who were in the backyard of one of the camps, and I told them who I was, and the oldest kid there says, "You were in that building over there that was made of doors." And I said, "Yeah." "How do you know?" "This is a story around here."
That's right.
But the building was gone. Okay, so under some termination of a socialization or something, my mother and father left the camp. Years down the road, around 1942, right after the World War started, they decided they were going to take vacation, and we went to Oakland Beach for a week. The next year, my mother convinced my father that we should go to Johnson's Pond for a week. And we rented a camp there, and then that next year, 1943 or 44, we rented another camp. And thereupon, my mother went and rented a piece of land, which we eventually built the camp on. And it was where the old dance hall was. And it had grown over. So, and there was my pseudo-sister, Claire, in the buildings thereby near, and we were back together again.
So what about your dad being a pro at the horseshoes?
Okay, so what would happen is after we built the camp, my father built a horseshoe court, and he'd be out there throwing shoes, and some of the neighbors who were getting to know him would come over and watch him. So if we were there in the summer on a weekend, they had visitors, and they were playing horseshoes in their yard. So on Sunday afternoon, they'd bring the leader, the winner, over to contest my father.
Meet Leo.
Meet Leo and see how good you are, because he's pretty good. Well, the thing of it was, my brother and I were the throwbackers, because my father would stand there and put 4 ringers on in a row.
So you'd run in.
And we would throw them back to him. My brother was pretty good on that part, so that worked out okay. I wasn't all that good a horseshoe player.
But your brother had the gift.
He had the gift. He could beat my father. He could give my father a tough time on ping pong, because nobody could beat my father on ping pong.
So he was just a all-around athlete.
He was all around.
What about the basketball?
Oh, we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
So at any rate, they'd bring these guys over Sunday afternoon, because they'd have to leave at 4 or 5 o'clock to go home from their visits to the people they were with. And my father would put 4 ringers on in a row every time. Well, that takes us to the backyard. The backyard, my father set up a little mini golf course with the Campbell soup cans as the cups. Because my brother and I had to dig the holes every year. So he would go out there and he'd trim the pants off us. Even on the sand and the sod, and I mean, he could get that ball in there. So anyway, one day, cousin Rem Tessia comes over, and he would come over on occasion to see Leo, Uncle Leo. He was Viola's husband. And we were friendly with Vi and Rem and all that, because we used to babysit Pierre when they would go to church, because my brother and I would go to church with them, so we didn't have to get up at 6:30 in the morning to go to church with my mother and father. So at any rate, my father beats Rem because they were playing the nickel a hole
At the golf game.
on this miniature golf course. And that turns out to be 35 cents. So anyway, Rem says, I'll pay you. Next week, next day, it comes over with a check for 35 cents. And that was on the wall inside the camp for I don't know how many years. It's covered over now, maybe. But when my father sold the place, that wall was covered. So, the basketball. Through the years, we had a basketball net on the garage in Providence of 71 Surrender Street. And George McCackey, Edgar Mott, myself, and my brother Gerald would be out there playing. We'd play a game 2-on-2. And so one day, we goaded my father to come out. And we said, you get 3 free shots, and after that, if you miss, you're done. I have a picture of him in my book that shows him with the ball. And we had to take the ball away from him. He put the ball in that basket every time. He has an eye. He had an eye. Oh, and the next thing was, what did I really learn from him was, because I could skate. And we had a victory garden in the backyard from World War II. And in the winter, he would flood it. And it would be probably 15 by 20.
That's a good amount.
And thereabouts, he would go out there and skate and do the figure eights and the twirls and whatever else you wanted to call them. He could skate. So anyway, we went down to camp many times in the winter, which the camp lake was frozen over. They used to put cars on the lake. They never afraid of that. But my father would never do that, believe me. But at any rate, we skated all over the pond, and then we'd come back, and he would race us. And he'd win. He'd do figure eights that we'd try to copy him. We couldn't do them. He just had physical ability. I've talked to guys about this, and they said he had the ability. He had him. It was his gift. Whatever he did, he could do well.
Is there a favorite memory of your mom?
Yes. I'd come home either from being out with the guys on the corner, or I came in after a basketball game from high school, and she would tell me how to operate and orient myself in the business world long before I got to be out there. She told me not to play around with the girls in the office. She says, because there'll be office talk and you'll never get where you're going. You'll get distracted. And you should always do what you're told. And if you don't like what you're doing, you can either quit or come back and make a better suggestion. She said, be nice to your boss, tell him how pleasant he is. And one of the things she told me, and I suspect my brother, and this paid off years later, was that anybody that gets you or Gerald to work for them has got a worker that knows what to do. They should be proud that they have you. So she was into the ego building already.
So,
But she made me feel like I could do what I needed to do. I could do it easily.
So one of the things I remember you telling me is that she helped you a lot with math.
Oh,
That she was a whiz at math.
she was not a whiz at math. We're in high school at the LaSalle Academy up on Smith Street in Providence, and there's a parents' night. So I didn't want to take her up there, but she heard about it and she said, we're going. I want to talk to some of these instructors, teachers. All right, I'll go. So we went. We got up there, and she walked around with the teachers and, oh yeah, he's doing okay. One of the teachers was the math teacher, and he said to my mother, he can do the work, but he's lazy. He won't study. She says, is that so? That he can really do it? He says, yeah, he's good. He's got a good head. Well, okay. Never said a word all the way home. We get home, and she pulls out all the business books that she studied from to learn the banking business. And she put them in front of me. And she took the textbook that I had in school. And the subject for which I didn't want to study was logarithms. Many of you don't know what logarithms are, but they're a method of quick calculations without doing the longhand multiplying and stacking the numbers. And she says, you're going to learn that stuff, Lee. And she put them on the dining room table. She put a chair right there. And she says, this is where you belong. She was very direct.
She knew your abilities.
She took it as a word from the instructor that I could do. So, eventually, and not too long after, because I wanted to get the heck out and play with the other guys.
Right.
So I had to learn logarithms. I taught myself from the book. And she would come in and she'd pull her books out and she'd give me some other lessons out of the books on banking, percentages and interest and that kind. She was going to make sure I had it. There was no two ways about it. And this aggressiveness of her pushing me has been with me for all my lifetime.
So that was her special gift.
That was her special gift. She made me stick to it and finish. That was the word that you got to finish. You can't start, you got to finish. And I've told this to these lovely 4 children of mine and any other person who I tutored along the way.
So when we talked about nicknames earlier, Mime and Pepe is what we called your parents.
You did.
And why did we do that?
Because you liked the French effect.
And that probably started with my elder sister, huh?
I don't know where it came from, but all of a sudden it was Mime and Pepe. And they liked it. That was Ma and Pa to me. That's how I grew up. So when I got married and I had children, of which you people are, I started to call your mother and I Ma and Pa. And you know what she did? She says, no, we're mother and father. That's the way she grew up, was mother and father. And Ma and Pa was not going to be Ma and Pa Kettle, if you remember the video.
Yes.
She just wasn't, your mother was not going to have it. Oh,
So,
here. You read this. You'll love it.
so what, if you needed punishment as a kid, which,
Okay, okay, we're okay again. It fell. If I had punishment.
what kind of punishment did you receive as a child?
One time, my father came home, and whatever infraction that could have been simple, my brother and I were restricted to the house for a week. Excuse me, a month. We could not go out. We couldn't go anywhere. And something happened at work where one of the worker bees' kids did something bad enough that they restricted them to the house.
Mm.
Lord only knows who or why, but we took the hit.
Did it happen once or twice?
No, that would happen once.
That was
I
it.
think that my mother talked him out of doing anything as simple as that. Because
When you were a child, what was the naughtiest thing you ever did? I think I know one of these things, but what was the
I'm not going to tell you, because I had the police after me.
Oh, I'm thinking of when you buried your dad's tools in the backyard.
Oh, the house on Byron Boulevard, we took and hammered, my brother and I, in some indescribable thought or process, we started pounding the screwdrivers in the ground. Now, you do remember that my father sold the house eventually.
Right.
Well, Newt Bostrom was the guy that bought it. And Newt started to dig the backyard out to put the porch on the front, on the back. And he came and told my mother and father, we were down at camp and he was visiting them because they were in business and they knew each other. And he says, yeah, I found all those screwdrivers. I told him he was nuts. He says, don't tell me I'm nuts. I know what I did. He was very direct, so it was true. My brother Gerald and I pounded screwdrivers in the backyard. Because my father couldn't find any screwdrivers, we would hide them.
How old were you?
Well, I had to be under 8 years old because we sold the house and moved out in 1939. That I know. So that would have made me 8 years old.
And that was the beginning of the war.
Yes. In fact, we moved into 71 Sorrento Street on a Monday. Was September 1st, and World War II started in Poland with the Germans. That was the beginning.
Wow. So, did you ever stay with your grandparents or your grandmother?
I never knew my grandmother on either side of the family. Because Uncle Pip, Olivia, and Teleswar was my grandfather on my father's side. I never met them. I wasn't born yet. They died in the 1928.
Were they ill or?
I don't know.
No one knows.
And I never met Daniel. He died in Schuyler, Washington. We have the obit in the file somewhere. And I never saw him or talked to him, and I never knew Catherine, so I never saw my grandparents, which was as I grew older, and I saw how you people had so much, my children, how our children, Pat's children and mine, had so much fun with their grandparents and enjoyed them and learned about us from a different perspective, I'm sure, that I enjoyed them enjoying my parents and Pat's parents. I did.
So, was there a favorite cousin that you have a memory of?
Well,
Rem.
Rem, and he was a married-in guy. The real favorite part was Aunt Bertha and Vi. Now you know that we camped out in Rhode Island, and one day we went over to Johnson's Pond to visit. Mm-hmm. And Vi found out that we were staying at a campsite near Point Judith. And she told me to get myself over there and I could put the camper in her backyard. And the only thing she required was that at night, don't slam the door. Because we didn't have a facility in the camper.
We used their bathrooms.
Yeah.
So that's all you have to say.
And that was a wonderful gal thought. And Aunt Bertha, we would go see her at Christmas time, and she would have us sign the latest tablecloth that she was making.
That's right. So she embroidered over our names, right?
Yes, she did. Lord only knows where that tablecloth is now.
So she was... Okay, go ahead.
She was my father's sister. And the thing that she did that is the memory of a lifetime, my father, when we came home in 1949, he's sitting at the kitchen table crying because his eyes are burning out. And that's the beginning of the eye situation in his family and my family. So he goes up to an optician and the doctor says, you're going to go blind for the rest of your life. So he comes back home with my mother and his eyes are really hurting. And it's glaucoma, and that's the lubrication of the eye. The lubrication wasn't happening. The drain holes were clogged. So anyway, somehow my mother calls up Aunt Bertha. Hello?
There's there are neighbors
Who's
out there.
outside having a
Oh.
conversation?
Yeah.
Oh. I'm supposed to be out there.
You're not.
No, Dad, you told me that they
Talking to
do
a
this.
contract.
They
every
do
year.
it, but I try to help.
Okay, so
Okay, so anyway,
we only have a few more minutes. So
yeah.
we're just
So
gonna-
anyway, Aunt Bertha, Aunt Bertha and Uncle Jim show up at the house because she wants to talk to her brother.
Yeah.
And they get the whole story there, and they go home, and the family doctor's been to the house already, and he can't do anything for her. So anyway, later in the day, Aunt Bertha calls up and says to my mother, we have an appointment in Boston with Dr. McDonough. Jim and I will take Leo up to Boston, and the doctor will do what he can do. And the reason was Lillian had an eye muscle problem that this doctor was grafting through that eye muscle to make the eyes straighten out.
Right.
So she knew a doctor she trusted. And she wheeled my father out of there that next day, put him on the train with she and Jim, Uncle Jim, and boom.
What does that mean?
He never got back. He went right into the hospital that day. And I'm going to Wentworth at the time.
Right.
So I'm up in Boston, and I could visit him. And I was still working nights at Howard Johnson's. That's another story.
So when he had his eye operation, did things improve?
Well, it took a few years. What they did was, today they use a laser to cut these drain holes. That's what they did to me. At that time, they put your head in a series of sandbags so you could not move it. And my father said, I saw that knife coming, the scalpel, coming right at me, and I just had to pray that God was going to take care of me. And they scalped the hole where the drain hole was supposed to be in both eyes, and he was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. And then he eventually got better, but he had cataracts, and they had to take him back. So it was a period of 3 years before he got back on his feet. And then he went back to work for 2 or 3 years, and he retired. He bought a car in the process. And I said, Dad, what do you, Pa, got me in a bad habit there. Pa, what are you going to pay the car with? He says, you guys could finish it if I don't. I said, well, okay. You know, I was making some pretty good money. So that was that.
What kind of car did he drive?
He had a nice, he put money under the table to get a 46 Chevy. This was when you couldn't get a car right after World War II was over.
So this was in the 40s.
It cost him an extra $1,000 for a car that cost $600. $600 or something.
So he had no problem throwing money down, huh?
No, he had it.
Oh, okay.
He had money always.
You always was squirreling away, huh?
Yes, sir. The joke of Lee Lanois was, my mother would say, Leo, I need some money to pay some bills. And he would reach in his back left-hand pocket, and he would pull out a roll that would choke a horse and give it to her. And I'd take the rubber band off it, and she'd take out what she wanted, and she'd put it back to him. And I thought that was miracle stuff. As I grew up, that my father took it and put it right back in his pocket.
He carried his bank was his role, huh?
Yeah. And
so he didn't believe in banks? I
no, I couldn't tell you that. The thing of it was, he took the roll from my mother and put it directly in his pocket. Now, I said, he never looked at what she took out. I was a dumb kid. So at any rate, the deal works out that I figured it out that he could count it later because he knew how much was there. Like, I got a roll here in my pocket that's $50 in.
All right, show us your roll.
You also know what your monthly bills are, Dad.
I don't even look at that anymore.
Once a
Here,
month you pay
it's right here in
your
an
bills.
envelope.
I mean, they have
Show it to
solid
the camera.
bills, telephone, electricity, fuel.
My mother took care of it.
Right, with a pocket of money. He knew
Yeah.
how much he was
That's
giving out every
640.
month.
No, that's $350 here. Excuse me. That's there.
Is that the minimum you carry around?
And I have a note that says it. You know, there used to be a note there that was 600.
Sometimes he doesn't have that much and we have to stop at the bank and get some.
Yeah, this one gets replenished, and there's also a
Wasn't
roll.
it inside
Oh
your
yeah,
wallet?
yeah. Well, I used to carry it in my back right pocket. Well, one day I got up and the damn thing was in the chair. So I said, to hell with that.
I'm gonna put it in my wallet where it should be, huh?
Yeah, that's wallet too.
God, you never left $350 in my chair. I'm going home to check the damn furniture.
You don't have to want.
Jesus.
Are you on camera? Just make
Yes.
sure you're on camera.
So
Okay.
at any rate, that's how I eventually became an adult.
Jesus, eventually.
I did, because I figured out what my father was doing.
Oh my God.
And he never let it on.
So your dad really, he always had money, but he never really believed
Yeah.
in banks.
Oh, the other thing I forgot about my father. He had glaucoma, he had his eyes fixed up, had the cataracts taken out. He was a champion bowler in the Industrial League
A bowler.
of duck pins. These are the mid-sized pins.
Yeah.
And he would roll 140, nobody could get at him. So he goes and gets his eyes fixed up, and he can't see the pins, and he still rolled 140. He knew where the hell the pins were. He would see a globe of white down there.
And that's it, huh?
And he would, and he played cards. That was his beer money.
He played cards and he was...
Oh yeah, they'd come up after the bowl and they would go into the kitchen and they'd play cards till 1 or 2 in the morning.
So the roll in his pocket might have been from gambling.
Who knows?
Ah.
He worked every day, though.
We probably could have been.
He always had a job, always.
Yeah.
Well,
After World War I, he kept a job
Yeah.
solid.
So we talked about the Depression and how both your parents did pretty well.
Well, we lived. We had a house that belonged to the mother and father. He had a car, a 1930 Chevy.
Yeah.
He had previously had cars. There's pictures of him in New Hampshire with Aunt Ann and Uncle Doug and my mother and father, and their daughter was Patricia. Figure that one out. And yeah, so my father always had a car after he got out of the Navy.
So what I was referring to earlier was when your mom was not working during the Depression. I found photographs of her and asked her, because she was always wearing furs on her collars, and we used to get grossed out by the minks on the collars.
Yeah.
And I said to her, in this picture, this is 1931. It was or 1933. It was labeled, and it was her and a friend. And she said she was coming out of work. They were in front of a butcher shop. You could see that in the photograph. And I said, it was the Depression. How could you afford meat?
Well, she was not working after I was born.
So your dad did pretty well. If she could go in.
He got his $25 a week up until around 1946, and then they bumped it to 50
Not so bad.
from his brother.
From his brother.
Yeah.
Oh man. So
There's a whole story of the pencil business in Ancestry. I typed it in under Uncle Louie's name in case anybody wants to see it.
Was he your favorite uncle? I'm just going.
No, I had good relatives. When it was Christmas time, there was $1 in an envelope that my father would give me, or if we went to visit them at Christmas time, they gave us an envelope with $1, and as we got older, there'd be $5 in there. They were always supportive of every graduation. I got money, and right now I'm giving money to Maddie as she's going through college. And she's got to pay off her debts. Her father has helped her, but he can only help her so much. And I got the word from one of my children that I could help if I wanted to. And so I decided to, and I send her money twice a year to cover 6 months at a time. And she gets me a thank you note every once in a while, and the like of that. But all of the relatives were very gracious to me and my brother with gifts of money at graduations, even right through to college.
Did you have holidays together, all the relatives?
Only if we were at camp.
So in the summertime was a big deal.
Yeah, we would go over there. They had Uncle Louie's birthday party one time, and my mother dragged my father over there because he, in some sense, was embarrassed to be the brother of the rich man. he couldn't really see Uncle Louis as his total brother.
So what do you feel like it was? He was just intimidated by.
Yeah, he was intimidated by the money.
So when you had these get-togethers,
Yeah.
4th of July.
Oh, 4th of July was in your children and my children's time.
Okay, so it wasn't a big deal back then. You
No.
didn't have big picnics or anything where they set the tables
No.
up.
No, when you kids came along and we were camping down there, they may have had parades before. I wasn't in them even as a kid. However, I have visioned a picture of a parade of the last 10 or 15 years from Pierre's daughter's camera. And there's Philip in the lead of the parade, and he looks just like his father. So it's a throwback.
Yeah.
And I never got that picture out of her. She was a little looser. She had problems mentally,
Yeah.
you know, and I never could get that picture.
So what were your cousins, the ones that I met, what were their names?
Okay. I
With
I'm twisting around. There was Viola. There was Doris. There was Raymond. And then the last one was Louise. And she and I were buddies in the camps along with, as time went on, Claire. We were buddies there. Because I swam across the lake with Louise one time and didn't tell anybody. And we might have done it more than once, but I do remember once.
Did you get in trouble for that?
Nobody knew it to this day.
So on the lake, Johnson's Pond, how your parents had a place there?
Okay, they had the place with the doors.
Okay, so tell us the story of the doors.
I don't have much to tell other than the fact that I was born. Look at it again. My big feet. Just a moment. We're getting it. There it is. The place with the doors was just to the left of Vi's in that lot. And I don't even remember the doors. I can remember, one thing I can remember is Rem picking me out of the water and shaking me because I was going to drown. And Claire was there and called Rem and said, Lee's in the water. And Rem came running down. I can remember that. I'm about 3 years old. So Rem saved my life.
That's awesome. So the camp with the doors, you heard a story about it when you
Never have a picture of it.
Right. But the camp with the doors, everybody knew the story.
Oh,
When
even
you went to visit.
2008 when I was down there with Joan. We talked to the kids and the older one says, oh, that's the place that had doors. I says, how do you know? She says, it's a story that everybody tells. This is a 10, 12-year-old girl.
So this was built during the Depression when there was no wood.
That's right.
and-
Well, there was not a lot of money either, but my father made the best out of whatever pennies he could find.
And I remember the story of you and your dad, or you and your mom and your brother pushing the in order to finish building, you had to put the pole up, and you.
Oh, we're not there yet.
Okay. That was,
So anyway, as I told you, we rented a couple of places down there for weeks at a time in 40, 41, 42, 43. And then my mother rented the land for which the camp actually ended up on, and which is where the dance hall was that burned down. That's why nobody wanted that lot. I don't know why. But at any rate, we did rent that. And during World War II, my mother found out that you could buy $200 worth of lumber. And so she told us, says, Leo, I would like you to build me a camp. I'm almost remembering it. He says, what can you do with $200 worth of lumber? And he took out of his pocket this pencil that isn't more than 1.25 inches long. It's a stub. I always wondered why. One day I asked him why he kept a little pencil like that. He says, because he can't break it. Because when you're lifting stuff and you got a pencil in your pocket, it gets broken. You put it on your ear, she's telling me this. You put it on your ear, you lose it, fall off, or your head bumps on something. He says, that's my theory, he says. And he said, that's why, so when I've been around the house and all that kind of stuff, I still have in my junk drawer a couple of little pencils like that. So at any rate, we built a 12 by 18, and then we put a porch on, 7 by 14. So the part is we kept building, and to the point for which my mother said, these boys are getting big enough, they need their own bedroom. And she said, okay, we'll build them a bedroom. 12 by 12 added on. Well, he describes it to us that we're going to move the back wall out to the other end of that which we built as a deck. And we're going to do that. Well, we did. The funny part of it was one point in time in the traverse of this wall to the other end of the house was there was only 4 of us and we needed a 5th person. And my father, in his hilarity, and he would be funny sometimes, he points to a board and he says, Evelyn, would you hand me that board? So he nailed the end of the board to the part we're moving and the other end to the other side of the house that was stationary. And I saw him with his pencil. I said, what are you writing there, Dad? Pa? He says, Evelyn, that's your mother. We're putting her in another place. And she laughed, my brother laughed, we all laughed. It was funny.
And so you took...
So that gave us the 5th person to allow us to move the panel.
So he made... Basically was good at inventing...
Oh, yeah.
Anything.
He was mechanically inclined. His brother, Louis, was the one that made the pencil business work. He was an engineer. He built the equipment to build the pencil. That's the one thing about Uncle Lou. He was a mechanical engineer without dossier.
Right, self-taught.
Because he built the company. And all the tools he had, the tool makers that he had would build the machines that he said he wanted to do this particular job. So my father ran 3 machines in a row on one piece of stock that he and my father and Uncle Lou built together to do the job. So at any rate...
So we're going to wind up here because you're getting dry.
Yeah. So at any rate, we did get the building there. My father had a hell of a time trying to teach us how to shingle that building. Because the concept of shingling is unique. But we finally learned, and you're going to quit now?
Yeah, just wanted you to finish the story.
Done.
Okay. All right, thanks, Dad. And what's today? What's the date today?
Today is the 7th of November, Saturday at 12:19.
In time for lunch.
I know.
So, hi. Did you learn anything?
Yeah.